pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. John Roney, who is a native New Mexican, went to Minnesota as an undergraduate and had the common sense of returning to the Southwest, where he went to graduate school at Eastern New Mexico. He's been a long-term BLM archaeologist working in a number of states. His last and longest tenure was in the Albuquerque office of BLM, where he got to work on materials in the Four Corners area, little things like Chaco Canyon, for example. I met him first in 1995. Mike Whalen and I were running our archaeological survey out of Janos, Chihuahua. And one day this guy shows up from the north and wants to see this site, which people knew about, but assumed it was just related to Casas Grandes. And he looked around and clearly saw that it was very something different. Soon he collaborated with Robert Hard, and they've had several decades of very productive collaboration. Robert Hard went to the University of Arizona and then grad school at UNM, has been a professor at, and is currently a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio. In addition to working in the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, he also works in Texas, and I don't hold that against him. I first met Bob in the 70s when he worked for the Embrace Foundation, as I did under Stephen LeBlanc. I can't emphasize tonight how consequential their collaborative research team has been in helping us reevaluate and better understand the late Archaic and the origins of farming in the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. So it's really a treat for everybody to hear this really important, incredibly important research. John will be the presenter tonight, and Bob will join John at the end to answer your questions. So without further ado, let's get to the really interesting stuff.
All right. Well, first I want to thank Paul and Fran for inviting us to speak tonight, and I also want to acknowledge Bob Hard. You know, we've worked together for many decades now, and this is as much his work as mine. I'll be presenting it this evening. So I guess with that, let me go to the slides. Oh, there we go. All right, so tonight we're going to be discussing developments in what we call the Southern Basin and Range province, or the Borderlands Basin and Range. It's this area that's outlined in blue. Area below the Mogollon Rim consists of broad desert basins, and they're small to medium-sized rivers that flow through it. And that's one of the keys to what we'll be talking about this evening. We'll be focusing on the early agricultural period, roughly 1500 BC to AD 200. And we'll be dealing with four main data sets. The first one is where we worked in the 90s, is in northwestern Chihuahua. That's this area right down here. More recently, we've moved up into southeastern Arizona, working in the Duncan and Safford basins over here. And then we'll also bring in information from the Tucson Basin and from the site of La Playa in northern Sonora. And each one of these areas is associated with a major river floodplains: the Rio Casas Grandes in Chihuahua, the Gila River in Duncan and Safford, the Santa Cruz River in the Tucson Basin, and the Rio Boquillas at La Playa. Within this period in this area, we want to emphasize examples of what we call collective action. And those are endeavors that involve cooperation among multiple households. And tonight we'll be talking about cerros de trincheras, irrigation projects, and warfare. We also want to emphasize social innovations that are related to collective action. These include things like integrative architecture, such as plazas and kivas, social artifacts, what we call social artifacts. These are artifacts that did not serve utilitarian functions, but instead functioned in social and ideological realms. All right, we want to begin by contrasting lifeways prior to agriculture and prior to intensive agriculture. We want to contrast those with subsequent developments in the Southern Basin and Range province. So prior to the advent of agriculture, all people in this area lived as hunter-gatherers. Subsistence was based largely on plant foods, especially small seeds. Basic production units and residential units were nuclear and extended families. Subsistence patterns were flexible. Residences moved several times a year, and most cooperative activities took place within these family units. Examples of collective action in this time period could have included things like rabbit drives or perhaps organization of periodic social gatherings, but nothing that left much of an archaeological signature. Now, in this context, maize was introduced sometime prior to 2100 BC. By 2000 BC, maize was widespread in the southwest, northwest culture area, but apparently it had little immediate impact. People continued to live essentially as hunter-gatherers, and they incorporated maize into their economies in different ways. Some groups, many groups probably, did not even use it at all. In many parts of the Southwest, subsequent change was slow and incremental. Other crops were added. Maize increased in importance gradually. Residence patterns became more sedentary and residential structures more substantial. Societies gradually became more complex, eventually culminating in the aggregated agricultural villages known ethnographically in the Southwest. And this model holds well for much of the Southwest, but we don't think that it applies well for the Southern Basin and Range country. Instead, we see a rapid development of floodplain farming in this area. There was construction of substantial irrigation systems, increasing sedentism, aggregated villages. There were periodic episodes of intensified raiding and warfare, construction of massive fortified villages, and we call these Cerros de Trincheras. And there's also material evidence of increasing emphasis on social integration. In these important ways, between 1500 BC and AD 200, the Southern Basin and Range province contrasts with both the preceding era and with developments elsewhere in the Southwest, Northwest culture area. So we'll turn first to Northwest Chihuahua. And this is the site of Cerro Juanaqueña, which was the focus of our work in the 1990s. It's a 450-foot high hill that overlooks the Rio Casas Grandes. These ripples that you see on the side of the hill are artificial terraces, and there are about 550 of them on this particular hill. The individual terraces are arc-shaped. They're about 15 meters long generally and 3 to 5 meters wide. There are two main groupings. There's kind of a tight, highly organized group at the summit of the hill, and then a looser, less organized set of terraces near the base of the hill. And this is just a different view of that upper complex. One thing I might point out here, in addition to the terraces, which are the horizontal lines in this slide, there's also what we call a perimeter wall or a perimeter berm that defines the exterior boundary of a large part of the site. These terraces were used for residential occupation. We found 80 to 100 rock rings, and many of these we believe were residential structures. There are also midden deposits on the terraces that indicate residential occupation. There's evidence of year-round occupation by at least part of the population, and we estimate that 150 to 200 people called this place home for about 200 years. We wanted to better understand the amount of labor involved in constructing these terraces. So we reconstructed a life-sized replica of one on the nearby hill slope. Actually, it's on the backside of this little knob over here. Based on the results of this experiment, we estimate that constructions on Cerro Juanaqueña represented 30 person years of labor. The compact layout and presence of a perimeter berm suggests that the upper terrace complex at least was planned and built as a single unit over a short period of time. We estimate that 5,100 metric tons of rock and 5,800 metric tons of fine sediment were moved during construction of these features. Clearly, Cerro Huancaña is a major example of collective action, a project which required sustained cooperation among a number of family units. Artifacts on the site included 200 of these deep basin metates, which suggest really intensive occupation. There were innumerable monos and hammerstones and cores, lithic debitage, over 320 projectile points. We found stone spindle whorls, shell beads, bone awls, needles, and weaving tools. There were also more esoteric artifacts like cruciforms, small mortars and miniature pestles that were likely used to grind pigments. There were stone pipes and distinctively worn drills that were used in manufacture of the pipes. And we'll discuss some of those later on in the talk. Okay, so in addition to Cerro Huancaña, we located about a dozen other Cerros de Trincheras in northwestern Chihuahua associated with the Rio Casas Grandes and the Rio Santa Maria. We excavated terraces on 3 of these. Some of them, I should say, were probably built and used in later time periods. But the 3 that we excavated yielded early radiocarbon dates. And this slide illustrates those 3. There was Cerro El Canelo here, Cerro Los Torres here, which covered about 13 acres, and Cerro Vidal near the town of Mata Ortiz, which occupies an area of about 10 acres. So each of these other sites is about half the size of Cerro Huancaña, maybe a little bit smaller, and all of them had fewer artifacts. However, all of them had a similar range of artifacts, including the esoteric materials, and they had stone circles and midden deposits, all had abundant maize, and we believe that all 3 of these sites were used in the same way as Cerro Huancaña. This slide illustrates our radiocarbon dating results. Basically, the calibrated calendar years are at the bottom, and these little curves are probability curves that show the probability that any particular year, the carbon that produced the date actually dates to one of the particular years covered under the bar. So there are several takeaways from this slide. The first one is that Cerro Huancaña saw 2 distinct periods of occupation. The first one was overwhelmingly the most intensive occupation. It's represented by all of these dates here, 21 of the dates pertain to that early occupation. And these dates all fall within a narrow interval between 1300 BC and 1100 BC. Then we don't see evidence of use for a while. And then there's a secondary occupation here that much less intensive, right around 300 BC. So both occupations in the early agricultural period. Another important thing about the graph is how tight the dates are. We started running these dates and we kept getting like 2980 is the date that just kept coming up over and over again. And when we run a Bayesian analysis on these using the computer program Oxcal, the indications are that the span of occupation for that early intensive occupation was only about 200 years, which means that the features and the intensive occupation all likely date to that narrow interval. We have fewer radiocarbon dates from the other 3 sites, but they're also really interesting. It turns out that Cerro Los Torres and Cerro El Canelo both are exactly contemporaneous with that initial early occupation at Cerro Huanacaña. And Cerro Vidal, on the other hand, represented by these two dates up here, seems to be contemporaneous with the later reoccupation at Cerro Huanacaña. So use of these hilltop villages was limited to discrete intervals. At least that's the indication that we have at this point. All right, the final slide for northwestern Chihuahua here, we want to point out a couple of details. The first are the perimeter walls, and you can see this most clearly on Cerro Las Torres. This is what we call a perimeter wall, and these also constitute part of it. And it's a wall constructed like the terraces. They're rubble berms, but instead of going parallel to the contours on the hill, they encircle the constructed part of the site. So we see that at Cerro Las Torres. Cerro Vidal actually consists of a series of nested perimeter berms or perimeter walls. And it's a little less distinct at Cerro El Canelo, but still really visible. You can see it coming around the west and the southern sides, and then more or less around the western side as well. The other thing that I want to point out is this feature right up here. This is a stone circle that's constructed as the same way as the terraces and the perimeter walls, but it's almost a perfect circle that's 70 meters in diameter. And we'll talk more about that later on. We believe this is one of the earliest examples of integrative architecture in the Southwest Northwest culture area. All right, so now we'll leave northwestern Chihuahua, and we'll travel 150 miles north to the Duncan Valley along the Gila River in far eastern Arizona. And this site is Round Mountain. It rises 640 feet above the Gila River floodplain. There are several other early agricultural period sites on terraces at the base of the hill, including two definite pit houses, one of which were partially excavated. So looking at this site in plan view, you can see a perimeter wall. It encompasses most of the site. The site includes over a mile of terrace or berm walls, and it has 18 rock rings, these little red circles that you see here. One of these had a basin-shaped pit in the floor, like a storage pit in a pit house, and we believe that most of these are residential structures. The walls on this were interesting. They were constructed just like the ones in northwestern Chihuahua, but at intervals there are large slabs set upright in the walls. And we're not sure what those are about at this point. We think of them now mostly as a stylistic expression. And the lower slide here shows one of the rock rings with a test excavation unit in the center of it. So we have 3 AMS radiocarbon dates from this site, and they put its occupation between 800 BC and 400 BC. The rock rings and a wide range of artifacts indicate residential occupation. Groundstone artifacts are abundant, but they show minimal wear, suggesting a relatively brief occupation, perhaps months or years rather than decades. Projectile points include several Cienega-style points, just what we'd expect in this time period. The artifact assemblage also included 2 stone pipes and a small rectangular stone tray or mortar. On an early agricultural period pit house site at the base of the hill, we also recovered a donut stone, and illustrated a little further on. These findings reinforce the observation that these esoteric artifacts or social artifacts are ubiquitous on residential sites during this early agricultural period. Okay, the next site we'll look at is Sanchez Ruin, and it's located about 35 miles downstream from Round Mountain. It's located on the Gila River at the very head of the Safford Valley. And like Round Mountain, Sanchez is on a rocky hilltop. It's about 600 feet above the floodplain. The site has nearly a mile of walls, including partial perimeter walls, and several of these perimeter walls tie off on sheer cliffs, including along this western side and also around the southern end of the site. There are over 140 rock rings on this site, as well as a formal plaza that we'll discuss later on. That's this feature right up here. This is a drone photograph taken by John Wisenhunt. You can see continuous walls around the core of the site. It's this feature right here. And then just a large number of rock rings that make up the core of the site. And I'll also point out that plaza area that we're talking about is this sort of bare looking area right up here. So interpretation of this site is complicated by the fact that there are two distinct occupations, one during the early agricultural period and the other during the early ceramic period. And this is very similar to the situation at Tumamoc Hill near Tucson, which we'll come to in a moment. We obtained 2 AMS radiocarbon dates from a single rock ring that establish an occupation at about 650 BC. However, there are several hundred early ceramic period sherds concentrated mainly in this core area of the site. All identifiable vessel forms are tecamotes, and 3 radiocarbon dates from 2 different features indicate an occupation at around AD 350, which is just what we might expect from the ceramic assemblage. So we suspect that many of these stone circles relate to the early ceramic period occupation, but we can't be certain about either the massive perimeter walls or the formal plaza. All right, now we move about 100 miles further west to the Santa Cruz River floodplain in the Tucson Basin. And there's been just a tremendous amount of really top-notch research has been completed in this setting. And much of what we now know about the early agricultural period is based on data from massive pit house sites associated with the floodplain. What we want to emphasize here is the early agricultural period occupation on Tumamoc Hill, adjacent to the floodplain on the western edge of Tucson. This hill rises almost 700 feet above the floodplain. It includes about a mile of massive rubble berm walls, which the fish and others estimate required about 1,000 person days of labor to construct. And these are constructed just like the other Cerros de Trincheras, early Cerros de Trincheras that we've been reviewing. Like the Sanchez site, interpretation is complicated by the fact that there are 2 major occupations. The first was during the Cienega phase, and it's been radiocarbon dated to between 500 BC and 300 BC. The second was during the ceramic period Tortolita phase, between about AD 475 and AD 700. Some of the early dates, the 500 BC to 300 BC dates, come from a feature found in fill behind the massive walls. And that implies that portions or perhaps all of the massive construction took place during the early agricultural period Cienega phase. Okay, so just to summarize, we now know of 7 Cerros de Trincheras that are reliably radiocarbon dated to the early agricultural period. Those are indicated by yellow triangles on this slide. And to us, it seems very likely that others will eventually be recognized. It's really difficult to find carbon on these sites for dating. But I'm sure that if people are persistent, that they're going to get similar results from other sites. These sites all represent major construction projects that required cooperative labor far beyond the capabilities of individual families. And along with irrigation systems, they're the earliest archaeological evidence of collective action in the Southwest Northwest culture area. Potentially all 7 reliably dated examples were built and used between 1300 BC and 300 BC. They occur exclusively in riverine settings in this borderlands basin and range province. And during the early agricultural period, they're apparently absent elsewhere in the Southwest Northwest culture area. Let's see here. Floodplain irrigation is another early agricultural period activity that required cooperative labor investment. These ditch systems are best known from the Tucson Basin and to a somewhat lesser extent from the site of La Playa in northern Sonora. They began around 1300 BC, and timing of periods of maximum use vary by location, probably in response to local geomorphological conditions. Although not as massive and complex as later Hohokam Canal systems, these were much more than simple ditches. They involved the excavation of main canals 3 to 6 feet wide and sometimes over a mile in length. They included feeder ditches, diversion weirs, head gates, pond structures, and field borders. Jonathan Mabry estimates that construction of a 1.2 mile long canal system would have required about 319 person days. Furthermore, a myriad of tasks are required to maintain and operate such a system and would require approximately the same amount of labor. Therefore, to build, maintain, and operate an early irrigation system in the Tucson Basin would require about 640 person days the first year and maybe 320 person days each year thereafter. This level of effort would almost certainly have required labor contributions from multiple families. This slide shows the distribution of documented early agricultural period irrigation and current estimates of the date of their inception. We've mentioned Las Capas already. The earliest canals at La Playa date to about 1200 BC, but become much more extensive during the Cienega phase, 750 to 350 BC, and again between AD 50 and AD 350. We did not document floodplain irrigation in northwestern Chihuahua. But at the time that Cerro Juana Canyon was occupied, geomorphologist Lee Nord has shown that the floodplain was about 2 meters below the modern floodplain surface. And because of this discovery of early agricultural period canals along this stretch of the Rio Casas Grandes would be very difficult. We believe it's very possible that irrigation agriculture was practiced there as well. There's also the Safford Valley, where 2 canals have been documented in profile at least and radiocarbon dated to about 1000 BC, or AD1, excuse me. And then there's also this outlier at Zuni. These are several canals which have been reliably dated to about 1000 BC. But like the early Safford Valley canals, they're only documented in cross-section, and their full extent is not known. Matt Peebles has suggested that these were relatively small in scale and that they may have been just a minor component of the agricultural system there. In any case, they're well beyond the archaeological pattern we're describing here. Our point is that construction and operation of canal irrigation in floodplain settings was another widespread characteristic of the early agricultural period in the Southern Basin and Range province. It's another indication of a dramatically increased capacity for collective action during this period. So the third and final form of collective action documented in the Southern Basin and Range province during the early agricultural period is raiding and warfare. We initially inferred this based on clear evidence of costly residential occupation on the highly defensive Cerros de Trincheras. Over the years, many functional explanations have been offered for Cerros de Trincheras, and we tried to look at all of these with an open mind. But at the end of the day, the defensive considerations seemed to us to be the most viable explanation. For one thing, there's abundant ethnographic literature showing that raiding and warfare are often endemic in small village-level societies like those we envisioned during the early agricultural period. Looking at this practice from a global perspective, people do live on hilltops for a variety of reasons, but defense is the most common explanation, and none of the alternatives we learned about seem to apply in the Southern Basin and Range setting. The closest runner-up was monumentality, and by that we mean that the hilltop sites were built and occupied at great cost for non-utilitarian reasons, perhaps related to costly signaling or religious practices. And there's no denying that these sites have a monumental character, a monumental aspect. But this type of character that we've described as monumentality, it seems to always occur in the context of much higher population and in societies that were organized in more complex and more hierarchical ways than what we envision here in the early agricultural period. So for that reason, we'll be really surprised if it turns out that monumentality is the principal explanation for the construction and residential occupation of these sites. In addition to the settlement location, forensic observations often provide evidence of violence and warfare. Over 500 early agricultural period mortuary features have been reported, primarily from La Playa and to a lesser extent from the Tucson Basin. It turns out that there are high levels of skeletal trauma in this population, including cranial depression fractures, defensive perifractures, embedded projectile points, and human remains disposed of in a casual or disrespectful manner. We believe that these observations support the notion that intercommunity violence was, at least occasionally, an important characteristic of the early agricultural period in the Southern Basin and Range province. Raiding and warfare, of course, are classic examples of collective action. So thinking about collective action revolves around the idea that in many situations, group actions are fundamentally different from individual actions. Individuals are generally able to perceive their own self-interest and the interest of their own group, a small group, and to act on it. But this is not always the case for larger groups of individuals. There are many situations where it might make sense for members of a group to work together for a common goal, but individuals are motivated to act in some other way. The tragedy of commons is a classic example of this. Thinking about the early agricultural period, under threat of raiding and warfare, it might make sense for a collection of families to band together and build fortifications. But in some circumstances, it might make even more sense to stand on the sidelines while others build the fortifications, then join them when the threat becomes more imminent. Regarding irrigation, what's the point of cooperating in construction of a canal system if others who did not participate can later lay claim to part of the water? Many social norms and social institutions play important roles in mitigating these kinds of concerns. From this point of view, it makes sense that new forms of collaborative behavior, such as construction of irrigation systems used by multiple families, construction of large fortified villages, and participation in raiding and warfare, would be accompanied by new forms of social behavior, especially those that might increase group cohesion. And in fact, this is just what we do see. Okay, this is the plaza at Cerro El Canelo. This is the main complex of features on the summit of the hill at Cerro El Canelo, and you can see this down here is the large stone circle located in a low saddle between the main hill here and an outcrop over here on the side. And this is a close-up aerial view of the feature. It's almost a perfect circle. And what it appears happened is that people cleared off all of the loose rock from this area, exposing the fine sediment underneath, and piled the rocks around the circumference to form one of these berm walls that we've been talking about. We date this based on its incorporation into the overall layout of Cerro El Canelo, also the manner of its construction and the degree of patination on the rocks. And based on this, we believe that it's contemporaneous with Cerro El Canelo, dating to about 1200 BC, which would make it one of the earliest examples of integrative architecture in the Southwest Northwest culture area. This is the plaza at the Sanchez site. It has a circular or oval part that's about 15 meters in diameter, and then a larger rectangular area here that's 30 meters long and 10 meters wide. We suspect that this shape is more due to the landform than to any symbolic content, but who knows? Dating of this feature is uncertain. A nearby feature yielded the radiocarbon date of 650 BC, but it's also very near that core area of the site that saw intensive use at around AD 350. So really, this feature could date either way there. In any case, it's much earlier than anything else that we expected that looks like this. Another example of possible integrative architecture in the early agricultural period are oversized pit structures that are found in the large early agricultural period pit house sites in the Tucson Basin. And there is one of these on the summit at Tumamoc Hill. We believe that these architectural features were settings for ceremonies and performances that helped bind multiple households into cohesive communities capable of initiating and maintaining cooperative undertakings. And if so, there were two potentially complementary approaches. One using formal plazas for public ceremonies that involve large numbers of participants and even larger numbers of spectators. The other are more private spaces, the more kiva-like spaces. So throughout this talk, we've drawn attention to several classes of non-utilitarian artifacts. These appear for the first time, or at least they become much more common during the early agricultural period. And these include small bowl or tray-like mortars and miniature pestles. These examples are from one of the sites in northwestern Chihuahua and we found a large number of these. They differ a little from ones found in the Tucson Basin. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Ones that have been found in the Tucson Basin sometimes have remnants of pigment still attached to them, and that leads us to believe that they were used in processing pigments. Stone pipes are another unusual type of artifact that we've come to expect in these early agricultural period residential sites. You know, they come in a variety of sizes and shapes. And in addition to the pipes themselves, we often find heavily worn drills, chipped stone drills with diamond-shaped cross sections and really, really heavily worn edges. And replication experiments have shown that tools like that were used to bore out the pipes. There are also these cruciform, these unusual cruciform artifacts, and they're distributed throughout the area of early agricultural period and a little beyond that. They range from examples that are just barely shaped by chipping to examples that have been shaped by chipping, and people have begun to grind on them, grind the irises smooth, to really highly finished examples where all trace of the lithic reduction has been removed by grinding. Donut stones. This is the donut stone I mentioned earlier. It was found on a pit house site at the base of Round Mountain in the Duncan Valley. Some other examples of artifacts that we think of in this category are the small anthropomorphic figurines found in the Tucson Basin. These items are often interpreted as evidence of evolving religious beliefs, and we're sure that's right. We prefer to emphasize their social implications and that rituals, both public and private, help reinforce shared values and beliefs. And in this way, they contribute to group solidarity. Loosely following Binford, we've now begun to refer to these as social artifacts. So the developments outlined here did not occur throughout the southwest-northwest culture area. They seem to be limited to riverine floodplains in the borderlands, basin and range country in settings with high water tables. They represent a distinct adaptation to a specific set of geomorphic conditions. They constitute a strong archaeological pattern. This pattern of characteristics, interrelated through collective action, contrasts with contemporary practices in surrounding areas. In the past, we might have defined this as an archaeological culture. Today, we emphasize a more nuanced view. We've discussed 4 far-flung regions in this talk: Northwest Chihuahua, the Upper Gila, the Tucson Basin, and La Playa in Sonora. These areas evolved in similar ways, following similar trajectories. The inhabitants in each area interacted with people from other areas enough to maintain strong common themes, but at the same time, each area retained its own distinctive flavor. We might think of these as a distinctive ethnicity. For example, these knob trays that are found in the Tucson Basin, they do not seem to occur in northwestern Chihuahua. The early agricultural period ceramic figurines apparently limited to the Tucson Basin. As far as we know, cruciforms do not occur in the Upper Gila area. Certain projectile point styles seem to be largely restricted to one or another of these communities. And these are differences that we believe are related to group identity. They serve to reinforce us and them distinctions. Maintaining us versus them differences is another way that humans create and maintain in-group solidarity. All right, so we didn't want to close this talk without mentioning our book, Early Farming and Warfare in Northwest Mexico. It was published just this last year by the University of Utah Press, and it covers much of the material that we discussed this evening. And we thank you again for inviting us here.
Thank you so much, John. Those really are very interesting sites, and there's still, I'm sure, a lot to learn. It was very good. So we do have questions already, and I'm sure there will be more coming in. Welcome back, Bob. We'll get started. Is there any relationship between these trinchera sites and the one at Canadore Peak in New Mexico?
Well, I'll address that one. The site at Canadore Peak, well, first it's close to Round Mountain. So it's associated with that floodplain of the upper Gila. So that's one connection. It seems to be later in time. There are no radiocarbon dates from that site. And the dating at Canadore Peak is based primarily on the occurrence of two pit houses, it's on the summit, but below the very peak of the site, where all of the stone features are. Now, I know some people think that some of the rock art at Canadore Peak is archaic in age, and that could imply some kind of connection. But that's about all I can say about it.
Well, I'll add too that, of course, it's, it may be more or less the similar time period as much of the Sanchez occupation, that early centuries AD, like early pit house period, falls into that bracket.
All right. How about what creates these geological mounds across the flat plains?
They're volcanic geological formations. Right? So there's this big volcanic hill.
They're usually basalt or andesite.
Okay, there's a related question about the pipes then. I'm just go right into that. Are the pipes from Round Mountain basalt? And if so, are they similar to those found in the Tucson Basin?
Yeah, I believe that the pipes from Round Mountain are made out of basalt. Not sure about the ones in the Tucson Basin. Speaking just generally, they're usually made out of fairly soft rock, something that can be carved fairly easily. Some are made out of volcanic tuff. I know of a couple made out of scoria. The cruciforms, on the other hand, they're also made by grinding, by abrasion, but they're almost always made out of really hard stone.
All right. Have you been able to make a comparison of rock art styles among the Cerro de Trinchera sites, which might indicate the extent of collective action and intercommunity violence?
Well, we haven't really tried to do that systematically. We documented the rock art on Cerro Juanacana extensively, and it's primarily Medio period in age, much later. Dates to maybe the 1200s, 1300s. There are a very small number of rock art elements that are more heavily patinated than the others on Cerro Juanacana that we suspect may pertain to the early agricultural period, but they're not representational at all. So, and I know that there's also extensive rock art at Cerro Los Torres that we really weren't able to do anything with. Canadore Peak, of course, has a lot, and Tumamoc Hill has a lot as well. But I wouldn't be able to comment on the age of most of that or what the iconography might reflect.
All right. What types of artifacts were found in the plaza areas?
So the plaza at Sanchez, there were brownware sherds and chipped stone similar to what we saw across the rest of the site. There was nothing particularly unique to the plaza. But had any particular unusual qualities. There were a couple of houses, rock rings adjacent to the plaza at Sanchez, but there was nothing unusual or distinctive about the artifacts. Mm-hmm. At Canelo, John, I don't remember anything distinctive about the artifacts at Canelo. There wasn't much there.
No.
All right, a couple of questions about the comment about some of the artifacts being non-utilitarian. So Bill Doolittle wants to know, why do you call the pipes, mortar and pestles, donut stones, and cruciforms non-utilitarian? And then someone else asked, are you suggesting the round stones with the hole in the center could be a pipe? Those are kind of related. And why do you call them non-utilitarian?
Okay, by non-utilitarian, we mean that they don't play a direct role in subsistence or manufacturing activities. Instead, in my thinking, it goes back to that distinction that Benford drew between where he distinguished utilitarian artifacts from ideotechnic and sociotechnic artifacts. And we're sort of lumping those two categories together and calling them social artifacts. So the pipes had more to do with social activities. The cruciforms, early in their study, people suggested that maybe they were spoke shaves or some sort of scraper or graver-like artifacts. But as people looked at larger and larger samples of them, there are really no consistent wear patterns, and many of them wouldn't be suitable for those purposes anyway. The donut, no, we're not suggesting that was a pipe. It's just an artifact that we can't come up with any plausible explanation for how it might be used. There have been various proposals. Some people think they were atlatl weights, or not atlatl weights, digging stick weights. But at this point, we think of them more as objects that had some sort of symbolic content to the people that made and used them.
Okay, are the Cerros de Trincheras always found on igneous hills?
I can't think of examples of any that are not. But, you know, it's important to remember that their form is, you know, at least partly dictated by that particular setting. So if people want to live on an isolated, elevated landform, these isolated volcanic hills, they erode to form cobbles that are suitable for making these terraces. And if you're going to engage in that kind of behavior, it pretty much has to end up more or less like what I've been describing here. In country where the bedrock geology is primarily sandstone, it's not necessary to build terraces at all. So the same kind of behavior, living on an isolated, elevated landscape, might not look like a Cerro de Trincheras. You can follow that.
Yeah. Okay, and how might the habitation of these sites relate to climate? Where did the habitants come from, for instance?
Bob, you want to field that one?
Also, I mean, the general climate patterns would be, you know, generally similar to today. In terms of this particular geomorphological context that we think that have been particularly beneficial for agriculture. There are these river reach boundaries, in the words of Fred Niles and Dave Gregory, that the points in the floodplain where water is forced to the surface. And so we think they're particularly productive agricultural settings that would have been attractive for substantial farming and irrigation.
One thing I might add is that some geologists anyway, believe that there was a change in the depositional regime of many of the river systems in the Southwest at the middle Holocene to late Holocene transition. And many years ago, Bruce Huckle suggested that in the middle Holocene, the floodplain environments may have not looked a lot like they look today. They may have been much harsher, less fine sediment, a lot more flashy floods, a lot rockier, and because there's water, they would have been important for hunter-gatherer adaptations. But with the change in depositional regime, you still had erosion and deposition in the valley bottoms, but deposition began to predominate over erosion, and more fine sediment accumulated. And Huckle suggested that these riverine settings through time became more and more attractive. And I don't think all geomorphologists agree on this, but that's one idea that I think is real interesting.
Good. Let's see what else we have. Have any native groups commented on how they believe the sites may have been used or their purpose?
I know that Tumamoc Hill is really important to some Native American groups, but beyond that, I couldn't really comment.
Okay. Given your arguments about the defensive advantages, why do you think the Cerro de Trincheras patterns you have identified did not continue between 1100 and 1300 to the about 300 BC times? So 1100 to 1300 BC to about 300 BC.
Yeah, that's a good one, and one we puzzled over. I mean, there may have been. We do see correlating with the end of the occupation in Cerro Juana Canyon, the end of the first occupation, as a major flood event, and then you have building of the floodplain sediments again, and that correlate with the second occupation, and then another major flood regime at the end of the second occupation. But whether that accounts for that entire, whatever that is, 8 centuries or so between the two, I don't know if there's the shifts in floodplain regime, or we don't really have any information on that. Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, yeah, in northwestern Chihuahua, and I think the pattern of our radiocarbon dates indicates that use of the hilltops, residential use of the hilltops, was limited to really discrete episodes, and that sort of feeds into the raiding and warfare argument, in that that kind of behavior doesn't have to have been continuous throughout the period. We can hypothesize that perhaps it was only during intervals of particularly intensive raiding and warfare, or the threat of that kind of intensity, that people chose to incur the costs of living on those elevated landforms. And the rest of the time, they probably lived in more ordinary pit house villages, like those that have been excavated in the Tucson Basin. Northwestern Chihuahua, at least I assume that there are other pit house sites down in more normal settings closer to the floodplain. And in fact, we did, just kind of by happenstance, encountered one pit house site that dates to the early agricultural period. It was in pretty bad shape. It's a site called Ophelia's Well, but there was an example of that.
So this is related to the warfare and conflict question. Who would you suggest the early agricultural period people who constructed the terraces were defending themselves against?
It's so difficult to identify that. It's something we puzzle over, but it really is quite difficult. A lot of the literature on raiding and warfare among these sort of smaller groups is that there's constantly shifting alliances, right? And so you know, I don't, we have a difficult time identifying who those other people might be, or if they're people from nearby. I mean, one thing we do think of is those agricultural settings that would have been possibly a real target. The stored food and perhaps the fields would have been a target of whoever the raiders were.
Okay. Is there an approximate height for the usual perimeter wall? Would they be large enough to be used for defense? And then someone else asked, was there a difference between the thickness or the height of the outer walls versus the inner walls?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. The perimeter walls are usually more massive than the terrace walls. Gosh, I forget the exact figures, but at Cerro Canyon, well, the first time I went up there, I thought it was a geologic feature of some kind. It was just this, it was probably almost 2 meters high. But more than the height of the wall, what I suspect is that just the nature of the surface that it creates, those loose cobbles covering the surface, would make really unstable footwork if someone tried to run across them. You have to slow up and look down at your feet as you walk across them. And if you were trying to run and fend off atlatl darts at the same time, it would be really difficult. That's my idea how they work.
And similar to that is when you're up on one of those constructed terraces, you have such an advantage of looking down, you know, and you know, obviously you'd have not only the high ground, but you could see the immediate slope below. So there's an advantage of both sides of the wall.
You're only exposing your upper body, and the person that's downslope from you is fully exposed.
Okay, 2 related questions about the cruciforms. Let me find it again. I lost it, sorry. Would you know what they were being used for? And are they similar to ones found around the El Paso area? Is there a relationship, not similar, but is there a relationship between the ones in these sites and El Paso?
Yes, I've been looking at that question fairly intensively recently. And yeah, the distribution of those cruciforms runs from the El Paso area. It doesn't go much below Fabens, Texas, I don't think, down the Rio Grande from El Paso. It goes up as far north as Elephant Butte Reservoir. 2 examples were found at Gila Pueblo, but in a late, probably secondary context there. They're primarily made, the best evidence is that they were made during this early agricultural period, but they're definitely found in later contexts. 2 were found in a cache of shaman's artifacts at Pacumé, for example, and we think later people collected them, and their distribution extends, gosh, as far south as the state of Jalisco in western Mexico. One was found at a shaft tomb there. And they seem to be fairly early further south in Mexico, and there's some indication that they were still being made fairly late in prehistoric or pre-Columbian times in the Sierra Madre and Durango. So yeah, they're such an unusual form that you know, I'm confident that all that are in that continuous distribution are related in some way or another, but they seem to cover a really long period of time, and their use and significance may well have changed through time. And at this point, we don't really have much of a clue. We found 17 on Cerro Canyon and 1 each on El Canelo and Cerro Vidal. And many of the ones that we found were made of basalt. Basalt shows wear more readily than some other kinds of lithic material. And a lot of the ones that we found had just really light polish on the irises, the ones that had just been flaked. That it's what we call soft bagware, and that could imply that they were being carried in a bag or surrounded by some sort of soft material. Some people have suggested that they were gaming tokens. That's one idea. However, thought they were amulets of some sort. And I think it's a really open question.
A couple of questions about the crops. Was it only maize? And can you talk about what other crops might have been grown in those areas?
Well, it seems to be primarily maize. Gail Fritz was on our project in Northwest Chihuahua, and she looked at the amaranth, the pigweed seeds, and she saw how the seed coat was thinner than in wild, and she suggested that maybe they were going through the beginning stages of domestication or certainly cultivation. So that would be the other one. We didn't find any domesticated squash seeds, and those are actually quite rare in any of these time periods. So those would be the two, and of course lots of wild plants.
Okay, let's see. We still have quite a few more, so let's see if we can get some of these in. Is there much shell shown up in these sites?
There's not a lot of shell, but there's a local mollusk, and in several contexts we found fragments of these local mollusk shells, and then they were getting a very small amount of shell from the Pacific coast. I don't remember the species right off the top of my head.
I don't either.
Okay. And can you draw a direct connection between the people residing on the early agricultural chinchilla sites and the people who built and used the adjacent irrigation systems?
Yeah, I think that the primary connection there is the radiocarbon dating. The dates on Tumamoc Hill fall within the range of radiocarbon dating of the canal systems that have been excavated in the floodplain in the Tucson Basin. And the site of La Playa is the other place where extensive irrigation's been documented. And that context has been largely deflated, but there are radiocarbon dates that apparently do apply to the irrigation systems there. Mm-hmm. Of course, we don't know of the Cerro de Trincheras there. In the Upper Safford Valley, no, it's just a loose association between the dates from Sanchez and relatively early dates on the canal systems found on the floodplain.
Okay. There's been some discussion of the advantage of updrafts off the valley floor, making the hilltops more advantageous for farming and occupation. Do you see that as possible? And again, could climate stress be the cause of moving to the hilltops? So,
yeah, we looked at that extensively, and in fact, we went to a great deal of trouble to plant thermometers, automatic recording thermometers up a transect, the slope of Cerro de Kenya. And indeed, the upper slopes have considerably longer growing season, like over 30 days longer. But on the other side, we really didn't, the terraces aren't constructed in any fashion that would be what we think is appropriate for farming. When terraces are constructed for farming, they usually have some sort of water retention capability. But these don't have that at all. Many of them have a slight forward slope, so they would not be good for, they're level instead of having a forward slope. The sediments are very coarse, rocky sediments, so they would not hold water. And in fact, and then the other thing that was so compelling for me in the work I'm thinking about where they use for farming is once we did all the measured the area of all the terraces, we figured it would be enough land to feed 11 people. In other words, it's just such an enormous amount of labor goes into constructing these terraces, but yet they would provide, you know, an improbable low level of sustenance.
Mhm.
It's just, you know, the only moisture, of course, is that falls from the sky. So indeed, so the bottom line is, yes, the thermal properties you could think of as more advantageous for longer, but growing season is not what's the constraint in Northwest Chihuahua.
All right. Is a tragedy of the commons approach appropriate when explaining these sites? For example, I have understood Native groups as ascribing to more of a stewardship relationship with the land rather than a commodities view of the landscape and its resources. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I brought that up just as an example of the logic behind the idea of collective action. The idea is that there are fairly common situations where there are sort of unique impediments to people behaving in groups in ways that would provide for their mutual benefit. It didn't really apply directly to the archaeological record that we were describing here.
All right. How about, were the areas completely covered in rock? And did they have to move those rocks for residential areas?
Yeah, the short answer to that's yes.
Yeah.
Those hillsides, boy, when you're on an unmodified surface, they're hard to even walk across.
And what is striking there is, you know, the upper slopes of Cerro, Kenya, and that core area of the Sanchez site. It looks like the entire area has been modified. I mean, on the Sanchez site, you know, that upper slope, it's as large as a football field. I mean, it's a vast area, and you know, vast majority of it, either the rocks have been moved or houses or little rock rings have been constructed on it, or walls have been constructed. So it is just a tremendous anthropogenic construction.
And any DNA? And did it tell you anything about the people who live there?
No DNA.
Okay. Would there be irrigation specialists who might just move from site to site, designing and supervising irrigation ditches, or do you think each settlement had their own knowledge?
I guess I'm fairly confident that each community had their own knowledge. But that's something I haven't really thought about. But I mean, they're distributed over a long period of time, almost 2,000 years there. So,
and usually you don't see real specialization at this level of political organization, this level of complexity.
Maybe an easy question. Any speculation as to what herbs they might have been smoking from those pipes?
Nicotine grew on the site.
Yep.
That's about the only indication. We recovered one pipe in excavation, but it didn't have any residue. We sent the sediment from inside of it off for analysis, but the results were negative.
And any evidence for other sites in the Gila River Valley between Safford and San Carlos?
We've only worked at that very head of the Safford Valley. So no, I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Okay, I have just a few more, so I think we'll try to get through all of them if you guys are up for it.
Go for it.
Okay. So were the dead cremated around these sites, or how were they dealt with?
We don't see any cremations, and we really haven't found any intact burials whatsoever. At Cerro, Kenya, we did find a few human bone fragments, but not any complete burials or cremations.
Mhm. Okay. And do your dates from the south, being earlier than those from the north, suggest migration? There's a couple of questions related to that.
I think the data is just so thin at this point. You know, we need data from a lot more sites. I mean, you know, you could interpret it that way now, but um, I just think we need more information to really be able to answer that.
Okay. And then someone else asked similar, does the similar style of the site suggest movement of the same groups of people? Or is this more attributed to independent invention? Is there anything that links them in the archaeological record?
I think they're using these hills in parallel fashion. I don't think that they're, you know, necessarily. I mean, but the idea itself is moving. It's more that people are constructing places to live on these rocky hilltops, and as John was describing earlier, when you do that, you get a very similar looking form.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we believe that there was interaction across, you know, large areas. I mean, maybe 40% of the obsidian at Cerro Canyon came from Sonora, for example, a source in Sonora. I'm sure people in northwestern Chihuahua were aware of other people at La Playa and people in the Tucson Basin and vice versa.
All right, I think this is our last one. Is there any archaeological evidence for construction sequence for the trincheras, walls, and features? Start at the top, work down, go around at each contour, or fill in the master planned concept, or was it haphazard? Any idea about that?
Yeah, we tried to look at that with the dating, and we dated all the features that we excavated at Cerro Kenya, and we discussed that issue. You know, was the center built and then it grew out? But we do not see that pattern at all in the radiocarbon dates. I mean, the radiocarbon dates from the terraces that fall into that 1300 to 1100 BC, we cannot discriminate any sequence, and archaeologically we can't see any particular building sequence.
All right, I think that does it for this evening. Thank you guys, that was really awesome. We really appreciate your time, and I know I kept you on quite long for questions, but there were a lot, so that was good. So thank you, and thank you everyone out there. If you're not a member of Arch and HIS, we would be happy to help let you join our group. We have many grants that we give out for researchers, and so check our website, get some information, and we will see you all next month for the April presentation. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.